there's a temptation, I think, in modern life, postmodern life, to focus on popes of recent memory, of the last century or so, or sometimes even of just simply of living memory. But that might not always bring to the fore in our imagination the most historically significant or even interesting, influential popes. So we thought we could just highlight 3 popes in this conversation from history who strike our fancy.
Right.
So given that preamble there, Father Hugh, which 3 popes shall we speak about today?
I think we begin with Pope St. Gregory VII, who was pope in the 11th century and pope of tremendous influence. So we can talk about him in a moment, starting chronologically. Then Pope Benedict XIV.
Okay.
Benedict XIV, a nobleman from the Lambertini family, Archbishop of Bologna, who also engaged in many initiatives which we still feel the effects of today, even though we may not know his name or know anything about him. And then finally, in the 20th century, Benedict XIV is from the 1700s. From the 20th century, Pope Pius XI. Okay, often forgotten because he's between the more famous Pius X and Pius XII, with Benedict being stuck in there before Benedict XV. And but his initiatives and his teaching were immensely influential and still are as well. So those are the 3.
So 3 influential popes, not necessarily the ones that would first come to mind in most Catholics. For most Catholics, if we ask who are the most important popes of history.
Yeah.
Great. So Pope St. Gregory VII is first on our list.
Well, Pope St. Gregory VII initiated what is called the Gregorian Reform. It's the second most common use of the term Gregorian in the Church's usage. Gregorian chant is one thing that goes back to Gregory the Great, but this is the Gregorian Reform brought about by Pope Gregory VII, St. Gregory VII, in which he sought to restore the life of the clergy to an apostolic norm, encouraging universal common life, universal celibacy, and a devotion to the ministry that is most of all in sacred worship and in the preaching of the gospel. And that combined with a reform of the church's relationship with the state to get the church free from invasions of secular power in her appointments and her day-to-day life and in her finances as well. So the church could be free and chaste, as he said, free, chaste, and Catholic. That is, she's not bound to anyone else. She's faithful to her mission, and she pursues it in complete liberty. And therefore, those efforts on his part were very much contested in his own time, and he had to suffer a great deal for that. He had to go into exile, actually, in Salerno, south of Rome, for a while. But he held firm, and finally, even emperors had to come hat in hand, barefoot in the snow, begging his pardon, as the famous scene in the history of the papacy of the time.
I think he died in. Certainly, his relics are in Salerno.
Right?
Did he die there? I don't recall in history.
Yeah, his relics are there.
His relics are there for sure.
Yeah, he died there. As he said, when he died there in Salerno, he said, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I have died in exile."
So you mentioned there the clerical celibacy and the reform of the clergy. You mentioned the so-called investiture crisis, about that relationship between the church and the state, especially with the appointment of bishops and their being invested with the mitre and crozier, the signs of their office. That was previously to this reform, the emperor gave those signs of office to the bishop. And popes,
or even a lesser noble.
Or lesser noble, somebody, but not the Pope. And then you mentioned that the third thing, I forgot what you said there, the celibacy, you said, free, chaste.
Common life, and also the conduct of divine worship.
Okay, yes, that's liturgy.
Course, yeah.
So how did all of this come from? Because, of course, he was a Benedictine monk there in the monastery of St. Andrew in Rome.
Right.
How do you think that this spirit of reform and the tremendous influence he affected throughout the rest of history because of his Petrine ministry came from his Benedictine life?
Well, interestingly, the reform of the clergy, which you wouldn't expect to come from the monks precisely, The monks were good at evangelizing the faithful and in providing a standard of spirituality, but they were not the first place you would go to have a model of common life of the clergy. That was the life of the canons regular, which is our life, that was inspired very much by Gregory's reform, the Norbertine life, that is. But the Abbey of Cluny in France had a tremendous impact on liturgical practice, ascetical practice, spirituality, exegesis of the Bible, devotion to Our Lady, just everything you can imagine. And it became very widespread and influential. And so the abbots of Cluny became very favorable to efforts at reform of the church generally, because, of course, they were spread out. The Cluny was arranged as a congregation with a mother house and then other houses. And so it was more organized and centralized than other monastic efforts in the Middle Ages. And so they had a pretty good view of the state of the universal church. And so he was naturally concerned with the reform of the church. And when he was raised to the papacy, he undertook that. This is where you'll sometimes hear that, the priest didn't have to be celibate until the 11th century. You hear that kind of stupidity. Yeah. No, the priests were required to be celibate for the purposes of the celebration of the liturgy, even married priests, already from the beginning, from the patristic period. But it was to restore the celibacy, to restore it where it had been lost or where priests had taken up with marriage or with concubines or whatever else. And then the common life of the clergy, they should live in common in clerical monasteries, after the example for the community of St. Augustine, for example, this rule we follow. And he wanted to see that restored, not imposed as something new.
Or created or invented or something.
Invented, right. And so that whenever you hear that all the time that celibacy wasn't that way in the beginning, no, priests were married, but when married men were ordained as priests, they stopped having the use of marriage. That was the Latin practice forever.
For the sake of the sacred liturgy.
Right. Because the it's part of the Eucharistic fast, the abstention from marital acts, and then also just the life of the priest needs to be devoted to those things. So often his wife would just become like in the category of the holy widows. She'd become like a religious herself. And that was not without consultation of his wife, obviously, but the fact is the priestly state required the practice of continence for the celebration of the liturgy. That's true even in the Eastern churches, which have married clergy who have the use of marriage. When they're going to celebrate the liturgy, the night before, they are not able to have relations with their wives. And that's true to this day, so that there isn't any place in the church, East or West, where if not habitual celibacy is required for the celebration of the sacred mysteries, at least actual, like today, this Mass, is required. And so I know it's a very deep and long-standing tradition to follow the example of Christ and the apostles. And that's, I remember I asked a Russian priest who was married with a bunch of kids, and I asked him about that. Is that still your discipline? He said, well, of course. He said, when you're going to celebrate the Holy Mysteries, your mind has to be completely free of all other considerations. He just smiled. So there you are. So
these gifts to the legacy of the Church from Pope St. Gregory VII are hard to underestimate.
Absolutely hard to underestimate.
Because we still live with them today and have ever since, really. And of course, then our order was born out of this reform movement. St. Norbert was part of this restoration of the common life of the regular canons.
But along with that, the clergy were also regarded as those who had an authority that went beyond the limitations of ordinary law to establish peace and harmony and to redress wrongs in kind of an extrajudicial way that wasn't violent. So basically, because there are lots of feuds. I mean, traditional European culture, especially in the north, with the Germanic culture, is very much tribal in that sense, and so there were feuds continually. Farther south, the Roman and Greek world had kind of eliminated that, except in Albania, and so that wasn't so much the thing. But going around resolving disputes and enmities and feuds was also part of the whole thing, to be a peacemaker.
So the church he wanted the church to be, as you said, chaste, free
and Catholic.
Catholic.
And so So in taking up all of that, he established a model for priestly and clerical life, which has remained continually ever since. The only thing where his reform was not successful in an enduring way was in the practice of common life. Because there, when it's money, people part very, very reluctantly with their material means. And since we have to have those means, there's always an ambiguity. You've got to have money, you've got to have material possessions in order to live. And so that the attachments that can develop are not immediately apparent, until it's, become something that is contrary to the idea of priests living in common and holding everything in common.
So it might be that he would have liked to have seen something more like the canonical life that we live, that is the clerical life lived in common, in our case, according to a rule of life written by St. Augustine, but he would have liked to have seen that for all of the clergy so that we wouldn't have what we call diocesan secular priests as such, living by themselves in a rectory with their own accounts and their own life.
Right. That's why his reform from that point of view would have been regarded as a failure, because he wanted the common life of the clergy as well as celibacy. And that's after the example of Acts. No one called anything their own, but they held all things in common, and distribution was made to each according as anyone have need. That was the scriptural basis for that. And he expected that to go along with celibacy, because after, we can admit, celibacy all by yourself is not necessarily the best situation. It's the common life of the clergy. That's why even in Europe with the secular clergy, in in Italy, for example, the parish house where the priests live was called the Casa Canonica. Because the priests lived there.
After the fashion of canons regular,
right,
almost.
Sort
of.
And the church encourages them to pray in common and all of that. But that was his great reform, and it was largely successful. Especially in the idea of the priest being the one who fostered peacemaking and the right conduct of divine worship and celibacy and chastity and sound preaching and common life to the extent to which it could be lived in the circumstances. But he was a great reformer, and the church still lives with that that reform all through.
Good.
Yeah.
Let's turn to, that's a lot about Pope St. Gregory, and there's a lot we could say about him. I mean, he's such a fascinating figure. And
the
like I said,
Saturday
so
Mass
close to us.
of Our Lady.
All of these things, so many things we could say.
Yeah.
But it's probably good for us to turn also to another pope. So the next one in chronology would be Benedict XIV.
Right, who lived at the end of the 1600s and died in the 1700s. He was Prosper Lambertini. He's from a noble Italian family of Bologna in central Italy in the Papal States. At the time, that part of Italy that was ruled by the popes until the 19th century. And he was a remarkable scholar from his childhood and a very accurate and eager student of St. Thomas Aquinas, very an expert in bibliophile, and really followed through on that kind of inheritance of the Renaissance and the beginnings of what would later be the Age of Enlightenment. There's just such an interest in knowledge in a universal sense. All right, so he was very, very keen on learning. So when he became Pope, he's the one that fostered the Vatican museums, the expansion and maintenance of the library, and beautification of things. I mean, he did all these magnificent princely things all over Rome. You can see his name in inscriptions almost more than anybody else.
Yes.
He was restoring fountains all over
Yes, there are
the
fountains with his
altars,
name all over them.
He consecrated altars to beat the band. I mean, there are altars consecrated by Benedict XIV all over Rome. And so he really liked those priestly and princely functions, and he performed them very eagerly and well. And but most of all, in the long-term history of the Church, is he established the norms for the processes for the beatification and canonization of saints. And of course, that has a tremendous impact. And although the norms have, they've undergone certain variations over time, they're essentially the same as they were then. He set up the standard, and that's what we follow ever since, with the congregation taking care of the beatification and canonizations according to a process whereby the heroic practice of virtue of the servant of God who's being considered is established by evidence and witnesses, and all their writings are examined. And then there's also the additional requirement that there should be a miracle to justify the beatification and then also the canonization. The only exception being that for a martyrdom, the martyrdom can take the place of one of the miracles. But he set that system up, which made the canonization of saints a very interestingly scholarly thing, because there was so much study that had to go into the case for a saint that it becomes a permanent archive of all kinds of interesting church history. So when you go into any particular epoch, one thing you learn to do is to look at the positio, it's called the full treatment of the person put together for their cause for beatification and canonization, and you just find everything there.
Yeah.
Right.
Historical, personal, biographical.
Yeah, all kinds of
so you can
things.
sort of enter into that moment in time.
And also you get their character, because the whole point of that process was to indicate that they had practiced the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, and the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude to an heroic degree. And that's what gets the whole thing started. They're declared venerable because it's determined that they practice it to a heroic degree. And then we continue the process waiting for the miracles to happen. And that's one of the wonderful things about this, is that he set up a process which, unlike anything else in the church today, still is based upon a principle which goes right back to the Gospels. Jesus went around and he worked miracles as a witness and a testimony to the truth of what he was teaching.
Yes.
And her canonization of the saints, which is indicative of the church's principal mission, that people become holy and reach heaven, the church still requires an actual, physically verifiable, examinable, miraculous occurrence in order to justify the canonization or beatification. So that's it takes us right back to the roots of things.
And Pope Benedict XIV codified and promulgated and sort of regularized all of that.
Right. He wrote a book on the beatification and canonization of the servants of God.
Yes.
He also wrote a beautiful treatise on the sacrifice of the Mass, too, which is lovely. Not as well known, but is really, really lovely.
And he has saints in his family. I
He has
think,
little
doesn't he?
Blessed Imelda Lamontini, the little
from Bologna, the little girl.
Bologna, right? The little Dominican tertiary saint who she was so longing for her first communion, and she was not allowed to make it, and because they insisted it being later, and so she's kneeling there on Ascension Thursday at the altar, and the priest is taking the Blessed Sacrament out of the tabernacle, and the host simply leaves the priest and comes flying across the sanctuary, and she kneels
And receives
the Holy Communion, and then promptly dies.
Yes.
So you can visit her lovely little shrine there. It's a great story. It's kind of like breaking the rules, but not really.
Exactly.
She was ready to receive communion.
And then the Lord was ready to take her home.
Right, exactly.
So beautiful. So that was his family.
Yeah, that's his
But
family.
he himself is not a canonized saint.
No, he's not. No,
right.
no, yeah. He was too much of a prince. It's hard if you have princely roles. It's very hard to get the canonization all together.
Politics tends to eclipse some of that ability to demonstrate heroic virtue in all of them.
Yeah, because you make decisions that may not always be perfect.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. So one of those other triumphs of history that is little known in the modern period, alas. And third?
And third, Pius XI.
Okay.
Now, Pius XI is my favorite pope of the 20th century. People look at you, how is that possible? Because they've heard about John Paul II and John the 23rd, of course, and Pius XII. But Pius XI is my favorite because he, first of all, he was a great scholar, and he was head of the Ambrosian Library in Milan. So he was a great lover of books, and that's a nice quality in a person anyway. That says a lot about someone if they like books, not just because they like to read. But they like books also as things,
the physicality of them and the beauty of them. And
right, we're here. We've got these beautiful books here, and he, as Pope, managed to establish the theology of and the feast of Christ the King, very important, as a response to modern political errors. Because in the 1920s, when he was first Pope, he had to deal with the rise of political ideologies that were inimical to the faith. And he was courageous enough that even when they were politically pro-Catholic, as in the case of France, he realized that the atheist foundations of their movement were dangerous, and he didn't want the French Catholics to go in that direction. So he was willing to be misunderstood. He actually condemned the movement. It was called Action Française. He condemned the movement, and for bad Catholic membership or reading of their newspapers or anything, And that gained him a tremendous amount of resentment because the French Catholic monarchist conservatives were thinking, why is the Pope doing this? But the founder of their movement was an absolute atheist who did not believe in the objective truth of the Catholic religion and held it only as a cultural form that needed to be kept in order to combat these other political errors. So it's a completely politicized understanding of the faith. And if people don't like that now, but just saying, well, at least they were keeping Catholic schools. Well, the thing is, yes, but how do we feel about ardent Catholics who are infected with communist ideas and their political judgments? Wouldn't we want the church to intervene and say, stop it? All right. And so similarly, if it's to the right, that doesn't mean it's more Catholic. Sometimes it just means that it's just political. That's all. So the church forbade Catholic participation in all of that, and he did that at a great price, but he had to do it. And in fact, that was one of the only cases of before the period after the council where the Pope was actually contested openly by cardinals. Pope, of course, he chopped. Took their hats
corrected
away.
That as well.
Took their hats away. One, the famous theologian, he ended up teaching Latin for the rest of his days in a Jesuit prep school, and he was the most famous theologian in the Roman Church, Cardinal Guillot. So he established the Feast of Christ the King and the theology of Christ the King in the encyclical on Christ the King as a response to these modern political errors, but then also went further and condemned communism extensively and intelligently, refuting its errors in another encyclical letter against the errors of atheistic communism, precisely called Against Atheistic Communism. That was the byline of the encyclical. And then also, when you have the rise of Nazism, he also published an encyclical attacking the errors of Nazism, and that one he published not in Latin as they usually would be. He had it published in German, Benedict XIV, and it was read from the pulpits of the churches in Germany. Sort of snuck in.
Yeah, they snuck in the text, I think, into the country because they had to, because it was people were suspicious of something like this happening.
Yeah, and the state would have certainly intervened, and the bishops were courageous. That was the point where Hitler's regime had not become so pervasively powerful that they were able to stop something like that from happening. But there were repercussions. But the letter came out, so he dealt with modern political errors, exalted Christ the King, established, particularly emphasized the importance of devotion to the Sacred Heart as a means of combating both moral and social errors. Just remarkable in every way. And then stood up to Mussolini. They didn't like each other. They're both kind of strong men. And Mussolini was just waiting for Pius XI to die. And when he died, he said, finally, he's gone. I don't have to deal with him. Well, then he didn't get everything he wanted, obviously, in life. No one ever does, and least of all dictators. And so he got another pope that was more suave politically, Pius XII, but still just as firm in maintaining the rights of the church. And it was under Pius XI that the rift between the Italian government and the Holy See was healed, at least officially, with a Concordat, which is still in place, establishing the territory of the Holy See and her rights as a state under international law and under Italian law. And that was all quite an accomplishment for him to do all that, that's resolving all the problems of the last century.
Yes, because prior to that means the so-called, the Pope being the prisoner of the Vatican, self-proclaimed, so that he wouldn't even appear publicly in the piazza. All of that.
He gave the Urbi et Orbi from inside the church.
From inside the church, so that really tense and difficult and seemingly impossible to resolve fight between the Holy See and the then Italian Republic. Yes.
Well, what was helpful there, and this is where Mussolini was helpful, for nothing else, he didn't oppose a generous settlement because the church had been deprived of so much property. And so the indemnity paid to the Holy See annually, it still goes on, was very important because the Pope had just been deprived.
Well, basically the whole
of
center of
means.
the whole center of the peninsula were the Papal States,
right? Yeah.
And the church lost all of that.
All of it, and not only the territory as a state, but also the church's own property and sources of income. So,
right.
So that had to be restored. And as we'll see in history of the church, they're always after the money. When the church is persecuted, it's not about religion so much as it's about wanting to get a hold of what the church possesses. Our Lord already told us that when we give up everything, he'll give us a hundredfold and we'll get persecution. That's just the way it goes.
Great, Father Hugh. So we are wrapping up this series. It's timely, of course, because as we said at the beginning of this episode, the cardinals are about to elect a new pontiff, the 267th pontiff. But it's important for us, and the reason why we put this series together, to avoid some of the political posturing in the moment of a conclave and to understand better just what is the papacy, how important it is historically, socially, obviously religiously as a matter of faith, and to rise above some of the vitriol or just simple politicking that's going on.
Vain curiosity.
Or vain curiosity.
I mean, the papacy is an immensely interesting institution, and the popes are various and colorful, and it's an opportunity to recommend to people that read church history. Get a decent history of the Catholic Church.
Yes, Warren Carroll or anybody else.
Warren Carroll or the old ones that were published by Image, Daniel Rowe.
Right. All
those things that there are any number of church histories you could read, but be sure that they're from a reasonably Catholic point of view, because there's a lot of hack church history,
with a spin.
Right, with a spin, and so we want to have the facts, But knowing church history is very helpful, especially when the church goes through a trying time and people are saying all kinds of different things. We can have a calm of soul and a serenity that, the church is always in stormy weather and always comes through peacefully and safely. Yeah.
And we'll pray that happens again in the weeks ahead.
It certainly shall.
Amen. Peace.
Sure.
Thank you, Father Hugh.
You're welcome. Sure.